Okay, so these are our notes for the Articles of Confederation. If you were not able to participate during class time, this will help you address the notes that you've missed. Just as a reminder, go to Moodle, click on the Articles of Confederation notes. There you are. You'll open those up, and you should see these, and this is what you work from. Okay, let's get out of this and begin to look at our notes. And so here we are. We're starting off with Articles of Confederation, which is the story how we became who we are. So here are our targets. Our targets begin with, I will be able to, 1, understand what form the government took at the end of the Revolutionary War. 2, define the 4 features of a state and the 4 roles of government. 3, describe and explain the issues and problems of the Articles of Confederation. 4, make the connection between Articles and Confederation to today's issues and problems. Just a reminder, and I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. If you are still typing things up while I'm speaking, then pause. Make sure and pause so you can get all the information that you need. Okay, so continuing on then. So we are now a nation of our own. We have to create a government, which for most people of the world considered impossible. It just couldn't be done. The only type of government that should exist was that of a monarchy or something similar to that. And so what we were doing was out of the ordinary. It was so completely out of the ordinary for most of the rest of the world that they believed it would not happen. It was going to be impossible, where we thought, yeah, we can make this work. So we begin by writing the first constitution, which is known as the Articles of Confederation, which is what we're going to be talking about. This is the first attempt at a formal legal relationship between the 13 states. So what we're talking about is, and this is a quote from the document, Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, meaning they saw it as lasting forever between the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So these were the 13 original colonies that are now becoming the 13 states of a confederation, which is a firm league, and again, another quote from the document, it's a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and the mutual and general welfare. It's important to note here, though, that in this document, nowhere do they speak about a nation or a national government. As far as they were concerned, these 13 colonies, 13 states, they were individual countries that were just loosely connected through this Articles of Confederation. Okay, and we'll ignore that. Okay, so what we are going to do right now is we're going to look at what's known as a confederation of sovereign states, or a sovereign state. So I am going to pause. All right, so we want to talk about what is a sovereign state. And so there are features of a sovereign state. And we're going to look at 4, and that should be in your notes. You should see a box with divided into 4. And so here are the 4 pieces that we're looking at. We're looking at, in order for something to be a sovereign state, we're looking at, first, there should be a population, a body of people, number of people, and certainly there were in the colonies. There were a body of people, part of these 13 now states. Territory, again, it's a defined space, and it would be for each, in the case of the Articles of Confederation, each state was a defined territory. North Carolina, South Carolina, Massachusetts, New York. So they're defined space. And then here's the kicker. With sovereignty, the power to make and enforce laws without having to check with any higher authority. This, for each of those states, was extremely important. They didn't want any other authority over them to in any way to control them. This allowed them to have that power to make and enforce the laws that they individually, each state would make. Each state made their own set of laws. Right? And within that state, then there was a government, and that was an organization that was put together to make sure that laws were enforced. So you have to have those four things to be a sovereign state. All right? Now, moving on. Features of a state then were, I'm sorry, that went backwards rather than forwards. So the four roles of a government then were these. So to protect the country, to keep order, to make laws, and to help citizens. Pay close attention to this. To protect the country, that's the role of government. To keep order, that's also the role of government. To make laws, and then finally to help its citizens. Protect the country, the army, protect the country would be the police and FBI and in truth the army. All of those would be, the military would help protect. They would also help keep order within the country. So protect the country, outside forces, keep order within the country. Make laws, then that making laws would be about ensuring that the population knew what was expected of them, also to protect the population. And then finally, help citizens, things like providing roads and bridges, also providing help in times of need, like we're experiencing now with the Hurricane Florence in North Carolina. They've been hit so very hard with flooding as well as wind damage. And so it is an extremely important part of the role of government. Right. So those things, features of a government right here, population, territory, sovereignty of a government, and then the roles of the government, the four roles: protect the country, keep order, help citizens, make laws. Okay. So the reason I showed you that short little PowerPoint was to get you to understand what these individual states, these 13 individual states, believe themselves to be. They believe themselves to be sovereign. And those were the jobs that they believed they were going to take on. So the Articles of Confederation then had 5 very important parts to it. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole Articles of Confederation. I don't think you need to know all of the pieces of it, but these 5 things are essential. First of all, and like I've said already, every state was its own country. Number 2, any changes to the articles themselves needed every state to agree. That was a unanimous. So think about that. You've got 13 individual states, their own country, and now you're asking them any changes they've got to agree upon. That's going to be pretty difficult. Then, number 3, no national executive department, instead a committee of representatives of the states or a national court. What they're talking about here is that they wanted to avoid a monarchy at all costs. That was not something they even wanted to consider. So even having one individual or even a small group of individuals being in charge, like an executive department, was not something they were willing to consider. They just didn't want to go back to what they had been. So instead they came up with the idea of having a committee, and all the representatives, all the states would send representatives to create a national court system. In truth, a national court system did not ever really occur. And the Committee of Representatives, in many cases, they didn't show up. So that was not bode well for the articles. Then we've got states can issue their own currency and put tariffs on trading of each other's goods. Tariffs means if you trade with another state, you can ask for an additional tax to be paid in order for your goods to be purchased. So we kind of created some instability between the different states. And then a central government did not have the power to make uniform commercial laws for the country. So even though there was a national government, it was so weak and so loose that it became very difficult for anything to happen. We're going to see more about that as we continue. So we're going to look at this, and if you'll look on your notes, this is at the bottom of the pages. You'll have to scroll down to find this particular piece, because this is important, because we will use this as a study guide. All right, so the Articles of Confederation states the states fear a strong central government. Again, that's about a monarchy. They fear the idea of going back to a monarchy, and for them, a strong central government meant a monarchy. So here's what they do. They establish a federal government, but it's very weak. They establish something known as federalism, which is a division of power between states and federal government. This is extremely important because it will continue even into our Constitution. So keep this in mind. I highlighted it for a reason. Go ahead and highlight it again. Okay, number 3, one branch of government, and that's Congress. And Congress basically has the all the decision-making power for any national government. Congress is made up of 13 members, 13 members meaning 13 states. All right, so the powers, however, ultimately lies with the states. There is very little power in the national government, and which leads to number 6, the federal government or national government has little power. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to move on a little bit. We're going to do this. Okay, so it became apparent that the Articles of Confederation needed revision. Several leaders called for future convention for the purpose of revising the Articles, and this meeting will be known as the Constitutional Convention. Interestingly enough, when they originally called this, only 13 people from the states showed up. Or I'm sorry, 3. I said 13, I meant 3. Only 3 actually showed up. But the handwriting was on the wall. There were some serious problems that were occurring in the states, and many of those had to do with the former revolutionary soldiers. We'll go into that in a little bit more. Before the convention can actually happen, an important event will solidify in many of the minds the need for a stronger central government, and that had to do with another rebellion called Shays' Rebellion. Now, if you want to see a little bit more information about it, you can go to this YouTube address and watch that. But I'm going to be able to give you enough information right here to be able to give you enough for the test. However, the video is pretty interesting. So, number 1, Shays' Rebellion had to do with returning soldiers from the Revolutionary War who were to be paid by the states. And that just didn't happen in Massachusetts. Some of the other states weren't real good at this either, but Massachusetts in particular wasn't so good. Now, a guy by the name of Shays, last name is Shays, he was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. In fact, he was an officer, and he was an officer that was considered, had a really good reputation. And when he came home, along with the other members of the Revolutionary War, the soldiers, they came home expecting to be prosperous. They had been before the Revolutionary War. The reason being that the British were who we sent most of our goods to, and they were willing to pay, and so that meant the colonies were prosperous. Well, once the Revolutionary War was over, there was a little trade between England and the American states. And as a result, the economy of the states began to suffer greatly, especially for the farmers. And what happens is many of them begin to lose their farms, their homes, or their farms to the banks or anyone else who's lent them money. And because that's happening, this money that they owe, they can be sent to prison.
It's called debtor's prison. That does not exist today, thank goodness. But in today, there is such, or back then, there was such thing as a debtor's prison. And and you would be sent to that prison until you could pay your debt. Well, of course, that doesn't make sense, because if you're in prison, how do you pay your debt? And that would leave your family, who probably then would lose their homes, lose their farms, and then the families would be left either to starve, to beg for money, or have to become indebted or indentured to somebody who would then they would be responsible for doing the work. So this was a bad thing. And then, to make things even worse, once you lost your land, you could no longer vote, because you could only vote as long as you were a landowner. Well, for most Americans, this was an important part of who they were, to be able to vote, to be able to make an impact in the decision making of their government. So they begin to remember what Thomas Jefferson says and said, but when in a long train of abuses and usurpations, meaning these soldiers began to feel like they were being abused and taken advantage of. And so Shays becomes their leader. They rebel and are in fact beginning to win. Finally, the states are able to pull together a militia, which eventually puts down Shays' rebellion. However, what happens is the Shays' rebellion clarifies the weakness of the Articles, makes it clear how weak they truly are. So the Articles, and then this portion, you need to go back to that bottom of the page, graphic organizer. You'll see, the top of it looks like this, and then we're going to the bottom, and it looks like this. All right. So Articles weren't completely bad. There were a couple things that they did which was good. They did establish a federal government. Weak though it was a federal government. And two, they established something known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This ordinance made it possible for new territory to become states. So that's pretty important, and it played a major role in the future of our country. Now, the bad portion, you can see right away, we've got 5 no's. No leader, no federal courts, no ability to tax, and no army, and no central monetary system. So central monetary system meaning the money was not universal. They had different money for each individual state. Then 6, 9 out of 13 needed to pass any new legislation. That means any new laws. Very, very difficult to get a group to agree. And then finally, need all 13 to agree for any amendment to the Articles. That was nearly impossible. And finally, the very ugly was no way to defend itself against attack or rebellion. This was brought forth by Shays' rebellion. They barely were able to put it down before Shays' rebellion had been completely successful. So in 1787, this is what was going on. And it was clear things were not good as a nation. We were extremely weak and open to possible attack. You know, England, even though they surrendered, they still considered the fact that they still believed that they might be able to come back and take over again. They were waiting to see us fail. And if you remember your history, in 1812, they do try to come back and take over. So after the rebellion, many who had opposed any changes were now ready to revise the Articles. And what becomes a major of importance is a guy by the name of George Washington. He comes out of retirement to preside over the convention in the summer of 1787. This was huge. George was so highly respected by not only the lawmakers, but also the the people of the country, that when he came out, they really saw this as something that was necessary. George had been contacted by any number of people asking for help, and finally he believed that he needed to do something, so he does come out of retirement to preside over this convention. Now, originally the convention was all about updating the articles, but it became a realization that that was not going to be possible. So from this convention, they create a new constitution, which was a big surprise to most of the people there and to the country. When they came out with, instead of a revised articles, a new constitution, most folk were pretty unhappy and were really suspected whether this was a good idea or not. Important part of this constitution, which made it very suspect, was the fact that they had formed a strong central government. And that, in order to do that, involved a lot of compromise. The debate over the proper limit of power on the central government will continue until its ratification debate, and it even still raises its head today. We'll talk more about that when we get to, as we look at the Constitution and
about ratification. All right, so little quote here: we keep moving forward, opening new doors and doing new things because we're curious, and curiosity keeps leading us down new paths, which is basically what the founding fathers believed. They had to keep moving forward. They couldn't go back to a monarchy. Okay, so that finishes our notes for this. And make sure once you are done with your notes, upload them to the won't go up to Moodle, please. There we go.